Okay, so we've learned about the monopoly diagrams. Now, let's go a bit more in depth with monopolies and their assumptions, as these really act as some A-star evaluation points. As mentioned in the how to evaluate video on my channel, one of the best ways to evaluate is questioning the assumptions you make in economics, as economics is all about assumptions. Right from the start, in year 12, you learn about ceteris paribus, so changing one variable and keeping everything else constant. So by questioning these assumptions, it really makes it easy to pick up a few evaluation points here and there. So the first assumption we make with monopolies is that they are pure monopolies, that they are one firm in the market with 100% market share. But as we mentioned, pure monopolies are basically non-existent now, and even legal monopolies are very rare. But if a legal monopoly does exist, there will be lots of other firms competing in that same market, so it won't just be one firm. So really good evaluation point there. Secondly, we assume a firm is a profit maximizer, and of course the profit maximization point, if you remember back to the monopoly diagram, is where MC equals MR. But as you know, firms can have thousands of objectives. For example, profit satisficing. Now, we'll go more in depth onto the specific objectives in another video, but easy evaluation point, a firm may be pursuing other objectives but profit maximizing. For example, maybe trying to increase its market share, and they can do that by sales maximizing. And lastly, we assume a firm sets high barriers to entry. Why? Because the incumbent firms want to maintain their monopoly power, therefore to stop new firms entering the market, the easiest way to do that is set high barriers to entry. But then this is also really easy evaluated. If you think about the CMA's job is to stamp out any anti-competitive practices. So if a company sets too high barriers to entry and is deemed to be limiting competition, the CMA will not allow the firm to do that. So it depends on the degree to which firms can actually set high barriers to entry. Whilst I was explaining that, I used a term called incumbent. Now, it's a bit of economic terminology which is quite good to use, and I'll be using it everywhere. So all incumbent means is a firm that is already in the market. So a good example would be the incumbent YouTuber in this scenario would be Econ+Style, then me would be the new firm entering the market. Now, I also mentioned barriers to entry. So what are these barriers to entry? So in monopolies market structure, there are incumbent firms that are already in the market. These firms have that monopoly power, they have a dominant position in that market. And because they have that dominant position in that market, they make large supernormal profits. If you remember back to the diagram, the box has supernormal profit. Now, they want to remain in this position, they want to maintain this position. So how do they do that? They do this by setting things called barriers to entry. So just a simple definition of barriers to entry would be set up by incumbent firms to stop rival new firms from entering the market. There's lots of different types of these barriers to entry. So there are legal barriers, sunk costs, economies of scale, and lastly, brand loyalty. And we'll go a bit more into depth with all of them now. So let's go a bit more in depth with legal barriers. So there's three main types. First one is patents. Apple's patent on Face ID. As you might know, Apple switched from Touch ID to Face ID. I think it was around when the iPhone X came out. So they became dynamically efficient, invested into new technology and moved from Touch ID to Face ID. But they have a patent on that Face ID, meaning that is a barrier to entry. Stop other firms using the same Face ID that Apple uses. And a lot of these examples I give are from normal everyday firms like Apple, supermarkets, etc, etc. So you don't need to remember some complex case study to throw in application. Just think about things in your normal everyday life and how they relate to economics. Do a bit of research on the stats, and they can actually act as a really good real world application for your exams. So patents the first big thing. Then we have copyrights. Absolutely thousands of examples of this, but Disney, Mickey Mouse, good example of copywriting. Then lastly, trademarks. Nike is extremely popular for setting trademarks. And overall, what is the entire point of these legal barriers is to stop new firms taking these incumbent firms' ideas, therefore acting as a barrier to entry. Because if you think about it like patents, if a new firm could just steal all that time, all that money Apple invested into developing Face ID, it would make it a lot easier for that new firm to enter the market. But patents allow Apple to legally protect, to legally keep that almost secret, therefore acting as a barrier to entry for new firms entering the market. Secondly, sunk costs. And the way I would define sunk costs is simply a cost that cannot be recovered if a firm leaves the market. And there are thousands of examples of sunk costs for firms. A big one is, of course, advertising, because once a firm sets an advert out, if, for example, they discontinue that product, they're not going to get that money back of what they've advertised for. Also, another example of sunk cost is actually training workers. Now, just imagining a chain of analysis of why high sunk costs would affect or stop new firms entering a market. And very simply, high sunk costs is going to lead to high costs of failure, therefore deter potential firms from entering the market, meaning that this is a big thing monopolies do. It limits the competition in the market. And an industry with massive high sunk costs would definitely be pharmaceuticals. If you think about how many billions you have to spend on machinery and then research and development, researching new cancer cures, new drugs. And how is any new firm meant to compete with the incumbent firms when they're spending billions on research and development? Moving on to economies of scale acting as barriers to entry. Now, whenever you're talking about economies of scale, the best way to develop your chain of analysis, and if you ever have a problem where you believe you don't have anything to write, your chain of analysis is always too short, tips like this can really help. So whenever you mention economies of scale, if relevant of course, I would always give an example. So how can technical economies of scale act as a barrier to entry? So these large firms can take advantage of these technical economies of scale, and they do that by investing into capital. This investment into capital will make their production more efficient and cheaper, basically increasing productivity. But remember, technical economies of scale requires investment into capital. And now think about new firms. Will new firms be able to make that investment and that magnitude of investment into capital? No. So small firms cannot compete. Why? Because they cannot justify the investment into specialist capital to experience those same economies of scale. This means they have higher production costs, and with higher costs, what does it mean for the firm? They have to charge higher prices. Now, this new firm has to charge a high, uncompetitive price compared to the large incumbent firms' low price, meaning that economies of scale will act as a barrier to entry for new firms entering the market. Lastly, a barrier to entry, unlike the others, is brand loyalty. Now, this links really well to behavioural economics, thinking about rules of thumb. So let's put ourselves in these shoes. There's a new firm which has no reputation, will also have worsened quality because it hasn't had the time to become dynamically efficient, invest into quality. Also, will have higher costs as cannot experience the same economies of scale. So therefore, we'll have higher prices, worse in quality, so why on earth would anyone want to buy from this firm? And this new firm has to face the almost perfect, established incumbent firm who has massive economies of scale, so it can sell at very low prices, is very dynamically efficient, so therefore means that it's a very good quality product, and all this just increases consumers' brand loyalty to that firm. Because if that brand continues to deliver over a long period of time, quality, low prices, that's exactly what brand loyalty is built up upon. And this is exactly another barrier to entry. So strong branding from incumbent firms makes it almost impossible for new firms to make any sales. For example, if you had Coca-Cola versus Aldi Coke and they were both exactly the same price, which one would you buy? Fairly simple decision. Then iPhones versus Androids. Androids may have far superior specifications, but people would still buy the inferior iPhone because they have brand loyalty towards it.